The last pull. There are moments in a man's life when the ground shifts beneath him. Sometimes that is a metaphor. On the morning of October 11th, 1995, for every man standing on the east bank of the Flat Rock River in Shelby County, Indiana, it was not a metaphor at all. It was geology. And it came without warning. The Liebherr LTM 1160 had been the pride of Consolidated Bridge Corporation's equipment fleet for 3 years. $500,000 of German engineering. A machine so precisely calibrated that its operators sometimes forgot they were operating machinery at all and felt instead like they were conducting an orchestra. Every movement fluid, every lift, a kind of controlled elegance. It could extend its boom 200 feet into the air. It could hoist 160 metric tons off the ground as smoothly as a man lifts a coffee cup. It had sensors for everything. Load limits, angle warnings, ground pressure monitors, computers that talked to other computers. The kind of machine that made engineers proud of the century they lived in. At 7:43 in the morning, Dale Prescott had been running cranes for 22 years. He had operated machines in Texas and Oregon in 3 different states along the Mississippi River Basin. He had lifted steel in rain and in wind and in temperatures that froze the hydraulic fluid and made the boom creak like a ship in a storm. He had never in 22 years felt what he felt on that October morning. The third girder of the Flat Rock River crossing weighed 42 tons. It had risen perfectly off the flatbed truck on the east bank, exactly as the first 2 had risen on the 2 days prior. Dale had checked his levels. He had checked his load charts. He had checked the wind speed, which was negligible, and the angle of the lift, which was well within the machine's certified parameters. The 4 hydraulic outrigger pads were deployed and locked, pressing down on ground that the survey team had certified as stable 6 weeks before the project broke. The girder rose. It swung. It began its descent toward the bridge abutments on the far side of the river. And then the east bank of the Flat Rock River decided it was done pretending. The outrigger pad on the riverside, the one bearing the greatest share of the load during the swing, punched through the surface crust and dropped 18 inches into soft clay in less than 2 seconds. Dale felt it the way you feel a car tire blow out on a highway. That sudden wrongness. That immediate understanding that something has ended that cannot be unended. He dropped the girder. It hit the shallow river and buried itself in the mud with a sound like a cannon fired into a lake. 42 tons of fabricated steel gone. But Dale was not thinking about the girder. The crane was tipping. With one outrigger sunk and the boom still extended over the water, the Liebherr began to lean. Not fast. That was almost the worst part of it. It leaned the way a very tall tree leans in the seconds after the saw cuts through that slow, majestic, inevitable arc toward the ground. Dale killed the engine. He was out of the cab before the machine had rotated 15 degrees. He hit the bank running and did not stop running until he was 30 feet away. The crane's 8-ton counterweight designed to balance the machine during heavy lifts was now working against it. The physics were simple and merciless. The front end went down, the back end came up. The boom struck the water with a sound that shook the air for half a mile in every direction, a concussive report that sent a column of mud and river water 50 feet into the sky. The cab rotated 90 degrees. The counterweight rose into the air like a monument. From the first shift of the ground to the final resting position, 8 seconds passed. Dale Prescott stood on the bank covered in mud to his chest, unhurt, and looked at what had been the finest piece of equipment he had ever operated. It lay on its side in the shallows of the Flat Rock River. Its boom submerged its tracks facing the wrong direction, its counterweight pointing at a sky that had been perfectly blue and indifferent to the whole affair. He stood there for a long time without speaking. There was nothing to say that the wreckage did not already say more clearly. Garrett Harmon heard the impact from the construction trailer 200 yards up the bank. He was on the phone with the project scheduler in Indianapolis when the sound reached him, and he knew before he opened the trailer door what kind of morning the next several weeks were going to be. Garrett Harmon was 45 years old. He had served 8 years in the Marine Corps, achieving the rank of first lieutenant before his honorable discharge in 1981, and he had carried the habits of that service into every construction site he had managed in the 14 years since. His sites ran like military operations, schedules documented, safety protocols drilled, equipment inspected on rotation. Every subcontractor held to the standard he had set, which was the standard the Corps had set for him, which was the standard of a man who believes that preparation eliminates most of what the world calls bad luck. He had managed 9 bridge projects for Consolidated. All 9 had come in on time. 6 had come in under budget. The Flat Rock River crossing was his 10th, and it was supposed to be finished by Thanksgiving, which was 6 weeks away, and which Garrett had never once considered not making until the moment he stepped out of the trailer and saw his crane lying on its side in the river. He stood on the bank for what felt like a long time. The water was still sloshing from the impact's small waves moving outward from the submerged boom in slow, concentric rings. The girder sat in the mud 12 feet from the east abutment, close enough that you could see how close it had come to being the day's success story instead of its disaster. Dale Prescott appeared at his shoulder, still muddy, still breathing hard. "Are you hurt?" Garrett asked. "No," Garrett nodded. He kept his eyes on the crane. There are men who respond to catastrophe with noise, with shouting, with the performance of urgency. Garrett Harmon was not one of those men. In the Corps, he had learned that the first response to a disaster determines whether it becomes a catastrophe or a problem to be solved. Shouting did not move cranes. It only exhausted the men who needed to think clearly. "Get everyone back from the bank," he said, "and call Dave Ennis at the equipment desk. Tell him what happened before he hears it from someone else." He spent the rest of that morning walking the site, documenting, photographing, thinking. He was good at the thinking part. It was why Consolidated had given him the job and why Garrett had believed he could deliver it. He was looking at the situation from every angle, the way an officer looks at a position he needs to take, measuring distances and forces and options. By noon, he had identified the problem with complete clarity. The clarity was not reassuring. You cannot right a 160-ton crane with another crane unless the other crane is at least as large. You cannot bring a crane that large onto ground that has already demonstrated it cannot support the weight. The east bank was compromised. The soft clay layer that had swallowed his outrigger pad extended based on what he could see and probe in the first hours at least 60 feet back from the river. Any crane heavy enough to do the job would sink before it could set up. The phone call started that afternoon. A company out of Omaha, a company out of Minneapolis. Both sent inspectors by the next morning. Both inspectors walked the bank, tested the soil, consulted with each other in low voices, the way doctors consult outside a patient's room, and came back with the same assessment. "Ground stabilization first," the Omaha man said. "Bring in engineered fill. Compact it in lifts. Let it cure. 3 to 4 weeks minimum before you bring in a larger crane. Then another week for mobilization and rigging." 5 weeks, Garrett said. He had 6 weeks until Thanksgiving. The other options were inventoried and discarded with the efficiency of a man who had learned to think without sentiment. A helicopter lift was proposed by a well-meaning younger crew member and died within the same conversation when Garrett pointed out that the Liebherr weighed 160 tons rigged, and the heaviest helicopter lift ever performed in the United States was roughly 25 tons. You would need 6 helicopters working in perfect synchronization, which was not a thing that existed outside of someone's imagination. Dewatering the site, pumping the water table down to firm the soil, was proposed by the same man 2 hours later and died for the same fundamental reason: they were next to a river. You could pump until the equipment dissolved from overuse, and the river would simply laugh at you. By the evening of the second day, Garrett Harmon was looking at a situation that had no good exits. The ground would not support a rescue crane. The alternative timeline was 5 weeks of stabilization work that would push the bridge completion into January, at the earliest possibly February if winter set in hard, which in Indiana it sometimes did with a ferocity that made the calendar seem like a suggestion. The bridge project had been running without incident for 4 months. It was on schedule and within budget, and it was the kind of project that Garrett had believed was the safest kind, the kind where preparation had done its job and left nothing to chance. And now a $500,000 machine was lying in a river because a soil survey conducted 6 weeks ago had missed what was apparently a very well-documented geological problem. On the morning of the third day, Marcus Webb, the youngest engineer on the project at 28 years old, came into Garrett's trailer with a file folder and a look on his face that Garrett had learned to associate with information that made problems more complicated rather than less. "I've been going through the county records," Marcus said. The historical soil assessments for this stretch of the Flat Rock Corridor. Garrett looked at him. There's a 1954 geological survey, Marcus said, filed with the county assessor's office. It was commissioned after a drainage project out here had some structural issues. He opened the folder and set it on the table. The survey identified a clay lens along the east bank, approximately 200 feet of it. The report recommended that any structure requiring significant point loading on the east bank be preceded by detailed subsurface investigation. Garrett looked at the folder without touching it. How detailed is the survey? Detailed enough, Marcus said. It names the clay layer, gives approximate depths, notes that surface crust conditions can make the ground appear more stable than it is under prolonged or concentrated loading. Garrett was quiet for a moment. How did our survey team miss this? Marcus chose his words carefully. I don't know if they missed it. I know it wasn't referenced in our pre-construction report. The distinction mattered legally, and both men in that trailer understood that. A survey team that had not looked for the 1954 report was negligent. A survey team that had looked and chosen not to reference it was something with a different name. Either way, the Liebherr was in the river, and the ground was still soft, and the 1954 report was 50 years old and would not pull the crane upright. Garrett picked up the folder and read the relevant sections. Then he set it face down on the corner of the table beneath a stack of project logs. He did not throw it away. He was not that kind of man, but he did not publicize it either. If the report became part of the official incident record before the crane was righted, the investigation that followed would involve attorneys and insurance adjusters and regulatory bodies in the kind of procedural gridlock that could push the project past any reasonable completion date. The crane needed to come out of the river first, then the paperwork. Marcus looked at the corner of the table where the folder now sat. Garrett looked at Marcus. Marcus nodded once and took his calculator and left. On the morning of the fourth day, Dennis Pratt arrived from the insurance company. He was a compact man in his early 50s, the kind of man who had learned to deliver bad news with the pleasant tone of a man discussing the weather, which Garrett recognized immediately as the most dangerous kind of professional to negotiate with. Pratt walked the site. He photographed the crane, interviewed Dale Prescott for 40 minutes, and then sat across from Garrett in the trailer with a legal pad and the air of a man with very firm opinions about liability. The company's position, Pratt said, is that any recovery operation must be conducted by certified rigging professionals using equipment and methods approved in advance by our technical team. Any improvised or non-standard recovery attempt that results in additional damage to the unit will void the policy coverage on the machine retroactively. Garrett processed this. So if we try something that doesn't work and damages the crane further, we lose the insurance coverage on a $500,000 machine. That's the substance of it. And if we do nothing while we wait for a certified operation, the policy covers reasonable delay costs up to 30 days. Garrett looked at the ceiling of the trailer for a moment. What constitutes a certified rigging professional? Any individual or firm holding current certification from the National Commission for the Certification of Crane Operators or equivalent state licensure with documented experience in heavy equipment recovery operations. Garrett spent the rest of the fourth day on the phone. The Omaha firm could not mobilize before the ground stabilization was complete. The Minneapolis firm said the same. A third company out of Columbus, Ohio, which he found through a referral from a former colleague, sent an inspector on the morning of the fifth day, walked the bank and said what the other two had said, which was that the ground was the problem and the ground was not something you could fix with a phone call. 5 days. The Liebherr had been in the river for 5 days. The project was losing $20,000 a day in delay costs, crew wages, equipment, standing time, subcontractor penalties beginning to accrue. Garrett Harmon, who had delivered 9 bridges in 14 years without missing a deadline, was standing on a bank in Indiana, staring at a machine that had defeated every expert he could locate and watching his Thanksgiving deadline recede like a tide that was not planning to come back. He was standing there, arms folded, looking at the crane when he heard the gate open at the northern edge of the site. She did not make an entrance. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people who came onto a construction site uninvited arrived with a particular energy, either the confrontational energy of someone with a complaint or the anxious energy of someone who was not sure they were allowed to be there. The woman who walked through the gate on the morning of the fifth day arrived with neither. She walked with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had spent decades moving across ground that needed to be read before it could be trusted. Which it turned out was exactly what she was doing. She stopped twice between the gate and the bank. Each time she stopped, she pressed the heel of her boot into the earth, held it there for a moment, and assessed whatever information the ground gave back to her. It was a small thing, and she did it without drama, and Garrett would not have noticed it except that by the fifth day he had become acutely sensitive to anything related to the ground beneath his feet. She was 78 years old, and she looked it, and she also looked like the kind of 78 that is different from the kind most people are. The kind that comes from decades of physical work and outdoor conditions, the kind of aging that makes a person look worn but not fragile, the way old leather looks worn, the way a well-used tool looks worn. She wore canvas work pants and a wool barn jacket and boots that had seen 1,000 seasons of Indiana mud. Her hair was white and cut practically short. She moved without hurry and without apology. She stopped 10 feet from where Garrett stood and looked at the crane in the river for a long moment without speaking. This was also notable. Most people who saw the crane for the first time spoke immediately some expression of surprise or sympathy or morbid appreciation for the scale of the disaster. She looked at it the way a mechanic looks at a broken engine, quietly, thoroughly, with the particular patience of someone who is forming a plan. "Morning," she said finally. Garrett looked at her. Sights closed, insurance situation. "I know what you've got going on," she said. "I'm your neighbor. I farm the north parcel. I've been watching your project since June." She said it without accusation. It was simply information. Garrett studied her for a moment. "You've been watching the site from my kitchen window. 4 months. She paused. "Watched your crane come in. Watched your lifts. Watched it go over." He waited. "Watched 5 days of engineers standing around trying to figure out how to get it back up," she said. "And I've been patient because I wanted to see if someone with the right equipment and the right plan was going to show up." Her name, she told him when he asked, was Vera Calloway. She farmed 480 acres on the north side of the property line that abutted the construction site. She had been farming it alone for 28 years since her husband Clifton died in 1967. Garrett introduced himself. He kept his voice neutral, the tone of a man who was managing a difficult situation and did not want to add complications to it. He appreciated the visit, he said. If she had concerns about the project timeline or the disruption to the area, he could connect her with the company's community liaison. "I don't have concerns," she said. "I have a solution." The word landed with a flatness that Garrett's brain momentarily refused to process. He looked at her the way you look at someone who has said something so disconnected from the situation that you need a moment to confirm you heard it correctly. "You have a solution. I can right that crane." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the Liebherr lying in the river, a machine that had defeated the Omaha Crane Company and the Minneapolis Crane Company, and a Columbus outfit with 30 years of heavy recovery experience. "You can ride a 160-ton crane," he said. "Not by myself," she said. "With my crawler. My grandfather's Caterpillar 60. We've had it on the farm since new." She said it with the same matter-of-fact tone she had used for everything else. 1928 model. She'll pull that crane up like she's pulling a stump. Garrett Harmon was a man of discipline, self-control. He had commanded men in difficult situations. He had maintained composure during equipment failures and subcontractor disputes, and 2 separate incidents involving personal injury on his sites that had required him to function clearly under the worst kind of stress. He was not a man who laughed at witnesses or bystanders, or anyone attempting to contribute to a problem he was trying to solve. He laughed. It came out before he could stop it. A real laugh, not a polite one, not the kind that is one step from a wince. The kind that bends a man forward at the waist. 2 of his crew members standing near the trailer steps contributed their own versions. Marcus Webb, who had walked over during the conversation, looked at his boots and said nothing, which was the wisest thing he had done all week. "A Caterpillar 60 from 1928, Garrett said, straightening up. "You want to right a Liebherr crane with a farm tractor from the Coolidge administration." Vera Calloway's expression did not change. Her voice did not change. She stood the way she had been standing since she arrived, with a stillness that was beginning to register in the back of Garrett's awareness as something different from passivity. "The Caterpillar 60 weighs 10 tons, Garrett said, his voice settling into the gently explanatory tone of a man who is being kind in the delivery of obvious physics. My crane weighs 160. You understand the ratio there? You can't pull something that weighs 16 times more than you do. You're not lifting it, Vera said. You're tipping it. There's a difference, Garrett stopped. That crane is on its side. Its center of gravity is already past the tipping point. All you need to do is initiate the rotation. Get it started, maybe 30 degrees of arc, and then gravity does the rest. Once it passes center, it falls back onto its tracks under its own weight. Something in the back of Garrett's mind stopped laughing. The pulling force to initiate that rotation, Vera continued accounting for the boom drag in the water, and the clay friction on the outrigger is somewhere between 12 and 15 tons. She said it the way you say the weather forecast. The Cat 60 puts out 65 horsepower at the belt. In first gear, she'll pull 22,000 pounds at a walking pace on flat ground. That's 11 tons of sustained pull, and I'll be pulling on an uphill angle, which reduces my effective force, so I can't hit the full theoretical, but I only need to get the rotation started. Once the crane passes its balance point, I ease off and physics finishes the job. Marcus Webb had stopped looking at his boots. He had his calculator out. Garrett looked at Vera Calloway. How does a farmer know the force calculations for a crane recovery operation? I don't know crane recovery, she said. I know center of gravity, weight distribution, and how things tip. I've been pulling stumps and righting overturned equipment and dragging stuck machinery out of mud for 53 years. Physics doesn't change depending on the price tag. She was not done. Your crane companies won't bring in a larger crane because the ground won't support it. They're right. Another heavy machine would sink before it could set up. But my crawler is different. She's 10 tons on 2 steel tracks, each track 12 feet long and 20 inches wide. That's 40 square feet of ground contact. My ground pressure is roughly 500 pounds per square foot. Your outrigger pads were putting down 3,000 pounds per square foot on the same soil. That's why your pad punched through. My tracks won't. Marcus Webb looked up from his calculator. The expression on his face was something Garrett had not seen on any face at this site in 5 days, which was the expression of a man looking at a number that makes sense. He's right about the ground pressure, Marcus said. And then he stopped and looked at Vera and corrected himself. She's right. Garrett Harmon stood on the bank of the Flat Rock River in the October light and looked at a 78-year-old woman who had just explained the engineering problem with more precision and more practical clarity than either of the 2 certified engineers he was currently paying by the hour. He stood there long enough that the silence became its own kind of conversation. Then Vera Calloway reached into the chest pocket of her barn jacket and unfolded a piece of paper. It was ruled notebook paper, and it had been folded and unfolded enough times that the creases were soft as cloth. On it in pencil were a series of calculations and a small sketch. The sketch showed the crane on its side, the angle of the caterpillar's pull, the approximate attachment point on the crane's frame, and a series of numbers that were clearly not today's numbers. These were not calculations she had made this morning. Garrett could see that from the wear on the paper, from the faintness of some of the original pencil marks beneath the darker revisions. When did you work this out, he asked. Day 2, she said, when your 3rd crane company showed up and I saw them shake their heads before they had even walked the full bank. I knew they weren't going to solve it. I needed to make sure my figures were right before I came over. I'm not in the habit of proposing things I haven't thought through. 5 days she had been watching from her kitchen window. 5 days she had been running the math on a piece of notebook paper with a number 2 pencil. Waiting, not because she wasn't certain, but because she was certain enough to wait until she was the only option left. Garrett looked at the paper. He looked at the crane. He looked at Marcus, who gave a small, careful nod. He thought about Pratt's conditions, certified rigging professional, approved methods. He thought about what the insurance policy covered and what it didn't, and what his own career looked like if this project went into the winter unfinished. And then Vera Calloway told him why she had really come. She told it without preamble, the way she had said everything else, which was plainly and without decoration. In 1932, she said her grandfather, Edmund Calloway, had owned the strip of land along the east bank of the Flat Rock River. He had farmed it for 40 years. During the Depression, when Shelby County was trying to establish a rural access route and needed right-of-way for an approach road and eventually a bridge crossing, Edmund had gone to the county commissioners and made them a proposition. He would donate the parcel's 60 acres of river bottom and approach land to the county. In exchange, the county would commit to building a proper crossing over the Flat Rock River that would give the farming families on the north side of the river access to the county road system without having to drive 12 miles out of the way every time the old ford became impassable. The commissioners had agreed. Edmund had signed the deed over in the spring of 1932. Vera was 15 years old that spring, and she remembered standing in the county clerk's office, watching her grandfather write his name on the line that gave away land his father had broken from raw ground in 1895. Edmund Calloway died in 1955. The bridge had not been built. The county had improved the ford and patched the road and found other priorities for 23 years. Clifton, her husband, had died in 1967. The bridge still had not been built. Vera had farmed the north parcel alone for 28 years after that. She had watched the county road commission plans change and change again. She had attended meetings and written letters and done what a private citizen can do, which is not much and takes a very long time. The Consolidated Bridge Corporation's contract to build the Flat Rock River crossing had been awarded in 1994. Vera had watched the crew arrive in June of 1995 with something she had not expected to feel at 77 years old, which was relief. "I came over here," she said, "because the men that land was supposed to serve are gone. My grandfather is gone. My husband is gone. My father-in-law, who used to drive the long way around every winter because the ford was too high, is gone." She looked at the crane. "And now the machine that's going to finish what my grandfather started is lying in the river because somebody didn't test the ground properly, and I am not going to stand in my kitchen window and watch that happen when I have a way to fix it." She said it without anger. It was not a speech. It was a statement of fact in the same register as everything else she had said. Garrett Harmon had been quiet for a long moment during this. He was a man who had been taught that leadership meant being the most certain person in the room. It was the thing the Corps had given him most reliably, the ability to project certainty even when he was not certain, because men needed certainty the way machines needed fuel. It was what had made him good at the job. He looked at Vera Calloway, who was 78 years old, who had done the math on a piece of notebook paper 2 days before he was ready to hear it, who had stood outside his construction site for 5 days, waiting for the moment when no one else had anything left to offer. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had the careful steadiness of a man who has decided something. "I respect what you've explained, and I respect why you're here. But this is my site, my crew, my project, and I need to think carefully about what we do next." He expected her to push, to argue, to deploy the emotional logic of the land and her grandfather and the 28 years of farming alone. Vera Calloway looked at him with calm, dark eyes and said, "And this is my grandfather's land." She said it with no more volume than anything else she had said, no more weight in her voice. Just the words delivered with the patience of a woman who had been waiting since 1932 for that sentence to matter to someone who could act on it. Nobody laughed this time. The October light came off the river in flat, pale sheets. The Lieb hair lay in the shallow water, its boom dripping its counterweight, standing against the sky. 20 feet away, a 78-year-old woman in a barn jacket stood on her grandfather's donated land and waited to see what kind of man Garrett Harmon actually was. The crew was very quiet. Marcus Webb held his calculator in both hands and said nothing. Garrett Harmon looked at the crane for a long time. Then he looked at Vera Calloway. "Bring your machine," he said. The next morning arrived gray and cold over Shelby County, the kind of October morning that reminds Indiana it is not far from winter. A thin mist sat on the surface of the Flat Rock River, curling around the submerged boom of the Lieb hair, the way fog curls around anything that does not belong in water. The crane had been there 6 days now. It had begun to look permanent, the way wrecks begin to look permanent after enough time passes, as though the river had simply decided to accept it as part of the landscape. Garrett Harmon had spent the previous evening on the phone with Consolidated's legal team in Indianapolis. The conversation had lasted 2 hours and had the particular quality of conversations that clarify problems without resolving them. The company's position was that any recovery operation needed to be defensible, which was the corporate word for insured, which brought everything back to Dennis Pratt and the question of certification. Garrett called Pratt at 7 in the morning. "I have a proposed recovery method," he said. I need to understand what documentation I need to make it compliant with the policy terms. Pratt arrived at the site by 9. He walked the bank again, which Garrett had come to understand was simply what Pratt did when he needed time to think. The walking was not investigation so much as processing. Then he sat across from Garrett in the trailer with his legal pad in his careful voice. The policy language requires a certified rigging professional, Pratt said. It does not specify the equipment. If you have a licensed engineer who reviews and approves the method and signs off on the operation, and if the person operating the recovery equipment can demonstrate relevant experience, the company's technical team would need to evaluate it. He paused. It's not a standard situation. No, Garrett said, it isn't. Marcus Webb had been in the trailer since 7:30. He had a legal pad of his own covered in calculations that he had been working since the previous afternoon, and a look of concentrated focus that Garrett had come to associate with Marcus, being either very worried or very certain, and this morning it appeared to be both simultaneously. I can prepare a technical analysis, Marcus said to Pratt. Force calculations, ground, pressure analysis, attachment point, specifications, recovery sequence, full documentation. I'll sign it as engineer of record. Pratt looked at Marcus for a moment. You're comfortable signing off on a recovery operation using a 67-year-old piece of agricultural equipment. I'm comfortable signing off on the physics, Marcus said. The physics work. I've checked them 3 times. Pratt made a note on his legal pad. The operator, he said. The woman. What's her documented experience with this type of operation? Garrett thought about how to answer that. She's been operating that machine for 53 years, he said, on a working farm. She's pulled stuck combines out of mud. She's righted overturned equipment. She's moved grain bins and cleared stumps and done every piece of heavy mechanical work that 480 acres of Indiana farmland has required of her for half a century. He paused. She did the force calculations in her head confirmed by pencil and paper 2 days before I was ready to listen to them, and Marcus checked every number and they were right. Pratt looked at his legal pad. He looked at Marcus. He made another note. I'll need a written statement from the operator describing relevant prior experience, he said, and I'll need the engineer's documentation before the operation begins. He set his pen down. I want to be clear that if this does not succeed and the crane sustains additional damage, the policy coverage implications remain as I described them. Understood, Garrett said. Pratt stood up. He looked out the trailer window at the Liebherr in the river. He looked like a man whose professional instincts were in a quiet argument with something else he could not quite name. For what it's worth, he said, and stopped. Then he picked up his legal pad and left. Marcus spent the next 3 hours at the trailer table converting his calculations into formal engineering documentation. He built the analysis from first principles, the way he had been trained to do, working through the weight distribution of the Liebherr in its current position, the rotational mechanics of the proposed recovery, the force requirements at different points in the arc, the ground pressure specifications for the Caterpillar's track configuration, and the attachment point geometry that Vera had sketched on her notebook paper, which he had transferred to a proper engineering diagram and confirmed against his own analysis. Every number she had given him on the bank 2 days ago was correct. Not approximately correct. Not within acceptable margin. Correct. He had been an engineer for 4 years. He had worked with senior engineers who had been in the field for 30 years and who still occasionally made assumptions that needed checking. He had never encountered anyone outside of a professional engineering context who thought in the terms Vera Calloway thought in, and he had encountered very few people inside that context who did it with her kind of economy. No wasted steps, no hedging, just the relevant variables correctly weighted, correctly applied. He signed the document and walked it over to Pratt's rental car at noon. Vera Calloway arrived at the site shortly after driving a rusted Ford pickup that looked approximately as old as everything else associated with her operation. Garrett met her at the gate. I need a written statement from you, he said, about your experience with the Caterpillar, prior heavy equipment, operations, recoveries, that kind of thing. She looked at him. How long does it need to be long enough to satisfy a man in a suit? She wrote it in the cab of her truck in 15 minutes. Garrett read it when she handed it to him. It was 2 pages handwritten in a clear practice script, and it described 31 separate instances over 53 years in which the Caterpillar 60 had been used for operations requiring significant pull force or precision load management. The descriptions were specific, each one noting the load type, the approximate weight, the ground conditions, and the outcome. It read less like a personal statement and more like an equipment log. He walked it to Pratt. Pratt read it without visible expression. Then he made a phone call that lasted 20 minutes, during which Garrett stood outside the trailer in the cold and watched the mist burn off the river. The technical team will accept the engineer's documentation and the operator's statement, Pratt said when he came back out. They're noting it as a non-standard recovery operation. The policy coverage remains contingent on the operation being conducted in accordance with the documented method. Garrett nodded. One more thing, Pratt said. His voice had changed slightly, a small thing barely perceptible. Good luck. He got in his rental car and drove to the edge of the site to watch from a distance, which told Garrett something about Dennis Pratt that the 2 days of formal negotiations had not. The Caterpillar 60 arrived at 11:45 in the morning. Garrett heard it before he saw it. The crew heard it before Garrett did because they were closer to the northern access road, and the sound of the machine came through the trees and the cold air with a clarity that stopped conversations mid-sentence. It was not a loud sound in the way modern heavy equipment is loud. The constant hydraulic whine and diesel throb and backup alarms and electronic chiming of contemporary machines. It was a different kind of loud, a lower, more deliberate loud, a sound that had no technology between itself and the air. 4 cylinders firing in sequence, combustion turning directly into mechanical force, every stroke of the engine audible as its own event in a rhythm that was almost like breathing. The crew stopped what they were doing. The Caterpillar 60 came over the small rise above the access road at 4 miles an hour, which was as fast as it went, and crested into view of the construction site like something arriving from a different era entirely, which it was. It was enormous for a machine of its age, taller than a man at the radiator cap, wider than a full-size pickup truck. The steel tracks, each 12 feet long and 20 inches wide, were studded with grouser bars that bit into the gravel of the access road and left impressions 3 inches deep. The engine was entirely exposed. Cylinders, manifolds, spark plugs, all of it working in plain view with no enclosure, no soundproofing, no aesthetic consideration of any kind. It was a machine that made no effort to look like anything other than what it was, which was a device for converting fuel into pull. Vera Calloway sat on the steel seat bolted to the frame with one hand on the steering clutch and the other on the throttle, and she sat the way people sit on machines they have operated since they were young, without thinking about the sitting at all. Nobody on the crew said anything for a moment. Then one of the iron workers, a man named Curtis, who had been in the trade for 25 years and had seen a lot of equipment, said, "What in the name of God is that?" "It's a Caterpillar 60, Marcus said. He had been reading about it since Vera had appeared on the bank 2 days ago. Built in Peoria, Illinois. Same basic track design that the British used as a model for the first tanks in the First World War. The Army used them to haul artillery in France. Curtis looked at the machine coming down the access road. "That thing was in World War I, that design was," Marcus said. Curtis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's going to use that to pull up the crane." "That's the plan," Marcus said. Curtis watched it come down the road. Then he picked up his hard hat, which he had taken off while they were talking, and put it back on his head with the deliberate motion of a man preparing for something serious. Vera brought the Caterpillar to the edge of the work area and killed the engine. The sudden silence after it shut down was as dramatic in its own way as the sound had been. She climbed down from the steel seat slowly, the way a person climbs down from something when the joints have accumulated several decades of memory about cold mornings. She did not look stiff so much as deliberate. She walked to where Garrett and Marcus were standing and looked at the site with the same reading look she had used on the ground the first morning. "I'll need the access to the water cleared on the south side," she said. "I want to come in from the uphill angle about 150 feet back from the crane on the solid ground above the clay margin." She had already identified where the clay margin was, Garrett realized from the test borings his crew had done on the second day, whose results were posted on the site board at the trailer. She was not using information she had been given. She had absorbed it from a public document and built it into a spatial model in her mind without anyone asking her to. He cleared the south access in 20 minutes. From the storage bed of her pickup, Vera unloaded the chain. It was a logging chain, forged steel links as thick as a man's thumb. Each link a closed oval of steel that had been made to tolerances that logging operations had established at life or death requirements, because in logging chain, failure was exactly that. The chain was 67 years old. It had been purchased by Edmund Callaway along with the machine in 1928, which meant it had the same provenance as the Caterpillar and the same maintenance history, which was meticulous and continuous. Vera had personally inspected every link in 1979 during the machine's full rebuild, and she inspected chains before heavy use the way pilots inspect aircraft before flight. The chain was rated for 30 tons. She needed 11. It was the right tool for the work. She coiled it over her shoulder and waded into the edge of the mud flat toward the lee pair. She wore the same boots she always wore. She did not ask for rubber waders or a safety harness or any of the personal protective equipment that the crew had available in the equipment trailer. She tested each step before committing weight to it, reading the ground through the soles of her boots the way she had read it her whole life, and she moved across the mud flat in a line that avoided the worst of the soft zones as though she could see them from above. Marcus walked to the edge of the mud flat and stopped watching. When Vera reached the crane, she walked its length, slowly looking at the frame geometry, the way she had looked at everything else without rushing, without performing the looking for anyone watching her. She was deciding where to put the chain. The attachment point she had sketched on her notebook paper was theoretical, derived from the crane's published specifications and her understanding of the rotational mechanics. The actual frame in front of her was covered in mud and lying in an orientation that made the geometry three-dimensional in ways that flat sketches simplified. She needed to verify the theory against the reality. She found the point she wanted approximately two-thirds of the way along the main frame from the track base, not at the top of the exposed structure, which would have maximized the moment arm, but also maximized the risk of the chain pulling the frame into a twist rather than a rotation. Not at the bottom, which would have minimized the rotational effect. Exactly where the geometry converted horizontal tension into the cleanest possible rotation around the crane's grounded track assembly. She hooked the chain. Then she stood in the mud for a moment with her hand on the crane's frame. It was not a dramatic gesture. Garrett, watching from the bank, was not sure she was aware she had done it. It looked like the gesture of a person touching something that has significance to them before undertaking something difficult. Or it looked like a person who simply always put a hand on a machine before trusting her weight to it. She waded back to the bank. Marcus was waiting for her at the edge of the mud. "Before you start," he said. His voice was quiet enough that the crew nearby could not hear it. "Can I ask you something?" She looked at him. "Have you done a pull like this before? Not the physics, the actual operation." Vera was quiet for a moment. She looked at the crane in the river. Then she looked at Marcus with the level regard of someone deciding how much to explain. "In 1963, she said, my husband Clifton tried to right a grain storage bin that had come off its foundation in a storm. The bin weighed about 8 tons. He used this machine and this chain, and he attached the chain at the wrong point too low, which meant the pull was mostly horizontal and not rotational. The bin didn't rotate, it dragged. The chain went taut in the wrong geometry, and when it failed fast. The chain end came back toward the machine. Clifton took the impact on his left shoulder and the left side of his chest." Marcus did not say anything. "He farmed through it for 4 years, Vera said. Reduced capacity, a lot of pain, but he farmed. The shoulder never healed correctly. In 1967, there was a pulmonary complication from the original injury. He was gone by March." She said it with the directness of someone who has had 30 years to find the words that carry the fact without requiring the listener to manage her grief. "This is the first time I have attempted anything similar since then," she said. "I've thought about the chain geometry every time I've looked at that crane for the past 6 days. The attachment point I've chosen is not the point Clifton chose. The angle is different. The rotational mechanics are correct in a way they weren't in 1963. She looked at Marcus. "I'm not telling you this because I want you to worry. I'm telling you because you asked and because you should understand that I have thought about this more carefully than most things I have ever thought about in my life." Marcus looked at the chain running from the Caterpillar through the mud to the crane frame. He looked at the calculations he had verified 3 times on his legal pad. "The math is right," he said. "I know it is," she said, and walked to the Caterpillar. The crew had arranged themselves along the bank in the way that people arrange themselves when they understand something significant is about to happen. Not clustered, not pushed to a safe distance, but spread in a loose line with their faces oriented toward the crane. Several of them had their phones out. Dale Prescott, who had not been particularly talkative in the 6 days since the accident, was standing at the far end of the line with his arms folded and his eyes on the lead pair with an expression that was too complicated to name. Garrett stood slightly apart from the crew. He had not issued any orders in the last hour. There was nothing to order. The operation was Vera's. The machine was Vera's. The method was Vera's. The chain was Vera's. His role at this moment was to stay out of the way and be present, which was not a comfortable role for a man who had spent his adult life being the person who directed events rather than witnessed them. Dennis Pratt's rental car was parked at the edge of the site access road. Pratt was sitting on the hood. Vera settled onto the steel seat of the Caterpillar 60. She made no ceremony of it. She set her hands on the controls in the positions they had occupied for 53 years, and she primed the fuel line and she engaged the hand crank. The Caterpillar 60 did not have a starter motor. It was a 1928 machine. It started the way 1928 machines started, with a hand crank inserted into the front of the engine block and turned with enough force and at the right moment in the compression cycle to initiate combustion. It was the kind of starting procedure that required knowledge of the specific machine's rhythms and tolerances. A stranger would have taken 20 minutes and a bruised wrist to figure it out. Vera had been starting this engine for 53 years. She engaged the crank, turned it through the compression stroke with practice force at exactly the right speed, and the four-cylinder engine coughed once caught on the second attempt and settled into its rhythm. The sound that came from the engine was the same sound it had always made. Not smooth, not refined. A raw, deliberate barking that said exactly what it was and what it was doing and made no apology for either. The exhaust stack above the engine threw a brief cloud of blue-gray smoke into the cold air and then cleared as the engine found its temperature and its stride. The crew that had been in various states of quiet conversation went entirely silent. Vera let the engine warm for 2 minutes. She watched the temperature gauge, which was an analog needle on a simple dial that told her what she needed to know without computer assistance. When the needle reached operating range, she put the machine in first gear. The tracks began to move. The chain, which ran from the Caterpillar's rear tow hook across the mud flat to the crane's frame, lay in a long, shallow curve across the ground. As the machine moved forward and the slack in the curve was taken up, the links straightened one by one, each one transmitting the tension further along the chain toward the attachment point. It was a slow process and it was not loud. Just the steady engine rhythm and the soft clinking of chain links pulling taut, and the grouster bars of the tracks pressing into the solid ground above the clay margin with a grip that left clear impressions. The chain went fully taut. Nothing visible happened. The crane did not move. The Caterpillar continued to pull its tracks, turning steadily, its engine note unchanged, the grouser bars digging into the earth with each revolution and finding purchase and holding it. 10 seconds. 15. 20. One of the crew members exhaled slowly. Someone else shifted their weight. The silence had a texture to it now. Vera did not increase the throttle. She did not change anything about what she was doing. She sat on the steel seat with her hands on the controls and applied constant patient force with the steadiness of someone who understood that the work happened at the pace the work happened and that impatience was not a variable in the equation. At the 25-second mark, something changed, not in the crane, in the chain. The links at the attachment end had been vibrating slightly with the tension, a faint harmonic that was more felt than heard if you were standing close enough. That vibration changed pitch. Slightly, barely perceptibly. Marcus felt it before he could explain what he was feeling. He looked at the frame of the crane and focused. The crane moved, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone standing more than 10 feet away. But the upper structure, the part of the frame that was exposed above the mud line, had shifted its relationship to the bank by an amount that could be measured in centimeters. A few degrees of rotation had begun, invisible from a distance, real at the scale of the physics. "It's moving," Marcus said, quietly, the way you say something when you want to make sure you're not imagining it. Vera heard him. She did not respond. She pushed the throttle forward by a quarter inch. The Caterpillar's engine deepened. The tracks bit harder. Clods of earth came away from the rear of the track, impressions, and fell back. 5 degrees of rotation. Then 8. The boom of the Liebherr submerged in the shallows began to rise from the riverbed. Water sheeted off the steel as it lifted. Mud came up with it in long, dark streamers and fell back into the river. The crew moved without realizing they were moving. They had all drifted forward by several steps, drawn by the same collective attention that pulls people toward the moment when something they have believed is impossible begins to prove itself possible. 10 degrees, 12. Garrett Harmon had uncrossed his arms. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his full attention on the crane, which was rotating slowly and steadily, and with complete indifference to how many experts had said it could not be done this way. 15 degrees. The counterweight of the Liebherr, which had been standing at an angle against the sky like an accusation, began to shift. As the crane rotated, the counterweight's geometry relative to the machine's center of gravity was changing. The mass that had helped tip the crane into the river was beginning its slow conversion into the force that would bring it back out. Dale Prescott, standing at the end of the crew line, uncrossed his own arms. 18 degrees, the chain went slack. It did not snap. It did not fail. It simply lost tension in the space of a second, the links dropping from their taut geometry into a shallow curve, and the change was visible to everyone watching, and the sound it made was an almost musical release of tension that in the silence of the site was very loud indeed. Several crew members made sounds, not words, the sounds people make when something goes wrong that they were afraid was going to go wrong. Vera increased the throttle, not reduced it, not stopped, increased it. The Caterpillar's engine note rose. The tracks bit harder into the earth. And Vera Calloway sat on the steel seat of a 67-year-old machine in the cold October air and drove forward with the same steadiness she had maintained for the entire operation, as though the chain going slack was not a problem, but a signal she had been expecting. Marcus understood first. He understood it in the instant that his mind ran the force calculation for the current position and produced a result that explained everything. At 18 degrees of rotation, the crane's center of gravity had passed through the balance point. The machine's own weight was now pulling it in the direction of upright. The resistance that Vera had been pulling against had reversed. The crane was past center. It was committed to returning to its tracks. The reason the chain had gone slack was that the crane no longer needed to be pulled. It was falling. Vera eased the throttle back. The Liebherr fell back onto its tracks. It was not a gentle return. 160 tons of German engineering returning to its operational position under its own gravity was never going to be gentle. The impact when the tracks met the ground was a shuddering concussion that propagated through the earth of the bank and could be felt through the soles of every boot on the site. The crane rocked forward on its tracks, then back oscillating with the energy of the return, and then settled. Upright on its tracks, in the position it had been engineered to occupy. Battered and muddy, and with one outrigger arm bent at an angle that spoke to the violence of the original fall but standing. The boom hung over the river, dripping. The counterweight was where it was supposed to be. The cab faced forward. The machine was standing. The sound that came from the crew was not organized. It was not a cheer in any structured sense. It was the sound of 25 men releasing 6 days of held tension in the same moment, and it came out as a wave of shouting and whistling, and the percussion of hard hats struck against thighs, and the sustained blast of 2 truck horns that someone leaned on simultaneously. 2 iron workers embraced each other with the unself-conscious force of men who are not thinking about what they look like. Marcus Webb flipped his calculator straight up into the air and caught it without taking his eyes off the crane. Dale Prescott sat down on the bank. He sat down where he was standing on the cold mud of the east bank of the Flat Rock River, and put his forearms on his knees and looked at the crane that was his machine and his livelihood and his 22 years of professional life standing upright in the October light, and he did not make any sound at all. Dennis Pratt got off the hood of his rental car. Garrett Harmon did not cheer. He stood where he had been standing and looked at the Liebherr for a long moment, and then he looked at the Caterpillar 60, and then he looked at Vera Calloway, who was sitting on the steel seat with her hands still on the controls and her eyes on the crane with the expression of someone confirming that what they calculated has in fact occurred. And then the engine of the Caterpillar 60 stopped. Not gradually, not with the sound of a machine being shut down by its operator, with the sudden complete silence of a machine that has ceased to function, The rhythm that had been the sound of the last 4 minutes simply ended, and in its place was the wind off the river and the distant sound of the crew and the dripping of water from the Liebherr's boom. The crew went quiet. The cheering stopped as though a switch had been thrown. Vera looked down at the instrument panel. She looked at the throttle in her hand, which had not changed position. She looked at the fuel gauge. The needle pointed to empty. She had driven the Caterpillar from the farm to the site at 4 miles an hour. She had warmed the engine for 2 minutes. She had pulled a 160-ton crane back onto its tracks. And she had done all of it on a tank of fuel that she had in the focus and preparation of the morning, neglected to top off before leaving the farm. The machine that had been running continuously for 67 years, that had never failed a task assigned to it on the Meyer farm or on any of the surrounding properties where it had been called into service, had not failed today either. It had simply run out of what it needed to keep going. Vera looked at the empty fuel gauge for a moment. Then she began to laugh. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind and not the kind that covers embarrassment. The laugh of someone who has been through something demanding and has come out the other side and found that the universe has left a small, absurd gift at the end of it. She laughed the way people laugh when they are tired and relieved, and the thing that is funny is genuinely funny, which is the best kind of laughing there is. Marcus heard it and looked at the fuel gauge from where he was standing, and then he was laughing too. And then the crew, who had not entirely understood what had happened, but understood the laugh, began to come back to noise. And this time the noise had a different quality, the quality of people who are laughing at something together rather than cheering at something separately, which is a warmer and more lasting sound. Garrett Harmon walked from where he had been standing to the base of the Caterpillar, 60, and looked up at Vera Calloway sitting on the steel seat above him. She was still laughing quietly now, settling into the long exhale after real laughter that leaves a person feeling lighter than before. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he reached up and offered his hand. Vera Calloway took his hand. It was a working hand that met his. The kind of hand that has spent decades in contact with steel and soil and cold weather, with calluses in the specific places that farm equipment leaves them, and a grip that did not perform strength but simply had it. Garrett had shaken a lot of hands in his life. Hands of generals and contractors and union stewards and county commissioners and every variety of man that construction and the Corps produced. He could not recall a handshake that said more in less time than this one. He held it longer than a formal handshake required. "How much do I owe you?" he said. It was not the first thing he had intended to say. He had intended to say something adequate to the moment, something that acknowledged what had just happened on the bank of the Flat Rock River in a way that matched its scale. But standing at the base of the machine, looking up at the woman who had just done what 5 days of professional consultation could not, the question of debt was the most honest thing he could find. Vera climbed down from the steel seat. She moved carefully, the way she always moved, after a period of sustained physical effort, giving her joints the time they required. When she reached the ground, she stood beside the Caterpillar and looked at the Liebherr, which was still dripping river water and still wearing 6 days of mud, but was standing on its tracks in the October light as though it had never been anywhere else. "Donation to the Shelby County Historical Society," she said. "Whatever you think is fair." "What's fair for saving a $500,000 machine in a bridge project?" Garrett said. She looked at him with the direct regard he had come to recognize as her default mode of attention. $10,000 would let them build the machinery barn they've been trying to fund for 4 years. They've got the antique equipment displays at the county fair every summer and nowhere proper to house the machines between events. She paused. "That's where the Caterpillar will go when I'm done farming." Garrett nodded. He was already doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with the Historical Society's barn. He looked at Marcus, who was standing nearby with his calculator and his documentation folder, and an expression that had not fully settled back to its professional baseline since the moment the chain went slack at 18 degrees. "Get me the Historical Society's contact information," Garrett said. Marcus wrote it down from memory. He had looked it up 2 days ago, the morning after Vera had first appeared at the gate, for reasons he could not entirely have explained, except that it had seemed like information worth having. Garrett took the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he looked at Vera. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "Your engineers," Garrett said, and then stopped and started again. "My engineers, my crane companies. People with certifications and equipment budgets and decades of professional experience. They had 5 days and they had no answer. He paused. You had 2 days and a piece of notebook paper and you had the answer. How does that happen? Vera was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking about what to say, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of what they already know to put into words. She walked to the caterpillar and leaned against the track the way you lean against something you trust with your full weight and without thinking about it. Your engineers were trying to solve a lifting problem, she said. They looked at a crane on its side and they thought about how to pick it up because that's what cranes do and that's how they're trained to think. Bring in a bigger crane. Generate a force greater than the weight of the object. That's sound engineering for most situations. She looked at the Liebherr, but I wasn't looking at a lifting problem. I was looking at a tipping problem, and those are different. A crane on its side isn't the same as a crane on the ground. Its center of gravity is already displaced. The work is mostly done. You're not fighting the full weight. You're fighting the inertia of the first few degrees of rotation, and after that, the machine's own weight becomes your ally instead of your obstacle. She paused. I've been moving heavy things with insufficient equipment my entire adult life. When you can't overpower something, you learn to find the angle where the thing wants to move on its own, and you just get it started. Garrett thought about that. This machine, she said, putting her hand flat against the track, it doesn't have a load computer. It doesn't have sensors that calculate what it's being asked to do and decide whether to allow it. It doesn't protect itself. She looked at him. Your modern cranes are intelligent machines. They calculate their limits and they enforce them. That's excellent engineering for normal operations. It protects the equipment and it protects the operators, and most of the time, it's exactly right. She paused. But when what you need to do falls outside normal operations, the intelligent machine tells you no. It tells you the load exceeds parameters. It tells you the angle is outside the certified range. It shuts itself down to prevent damage. And you're left standing on a bank for 5 days because every machine smart enough to assess the situation is also smart enough to refuse it. Garrett looked at the caterpillar. Its exposed engine had begun to cool in the October air, ticking faintly with contraction. This machine doesn't know what it's being asked to do, Vera said. It knows throttle position and gear selection and track speed. That's all it knows. So when I ask it to pull something it has never pulled before, it doesn't consult a database and decline. It just pulls. She looked at Garrett. The limitation is me. I'm the computer. I have to know what the machine can do and what it can't. I have to make the decisions the machine isn't capable of making for itself. And if I'm wrong, there's no system to catch my mistake. It's on me entirely. Garrett was quiet. Your father's generation understood that, she said. The men who built things before computers took over the decision-making. The operator was the safety system. The man in the seat was the intelligence. She looked at him with the level directness that had characterized everything she had said since the first morning. That's not nostalgia. That's not me saying the old way was better. Modern machines save lives every day because they don't depend on the operator being infallible. But there are moments when infallibility isn't available and you need something that will simply do the work regardless. And for those moments, this is what you want. She tapped the track once with her palm, a dull, solid sound. Garrett looked at the ground between them for a moment. Then he looked up. My father ran heavy equipment, he said, before hydraulics, before onboard computers. He used to say the operator was the safety system. Vera nodded. He didn't mean it as criticism of modern machines, Garrett said. He meant it as a description of what the job required of a man, that you had to be smarter than what you were operating, that the machine's limits were your responsibility to know and your judgment to work within. That's right, Vera said. He died in 1987, Garrett said. He would have understood immediately what you were doing out there. He probably would have thought of it before my engineers did. Vera said nothing. She did not offer condolence or agreement. She simply acknowledged what he had said with the quiet attention of someone who understands that some statements are not invitations to respond, but simply need to be heard. Garrett straightened up. He looked at the site around him. The crew was beginning to return to motion, the particular controlled activity of people who have witnessed something significant and are now processing it by returning to work. Dale Prescott had gotten up from where he had been sitting on the bank and was walking toward the Liebherr, to begin the assessment of what the crane needed before it could be put back into service. Marcus was on the phone already beginning to manage the documentation that the incident and the recovery would require. The Flat Rock River moved past all of it with complete indifference, carrying its October load of leaves and silt toward wherever rivers go, observing no schedules and meeting no deadlines. "I have one more question," Garrett said. Vera looked at him. "The land," he said. "Your grandfather's land. This is the bridge he donated it for." "Yes, and you were 15 when he signed the deed." "I was." Garrett looked at the bridge abutments on both sides of the river, the steel framework that would carry the crossing, the work that had been 4 months in progress and 6 days interrupted, and was, as of this morning, capable of resuming. "He won't see it finished," Garrett said. "Your grandfather?" "No," he was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter?" "Finishing it, I mean. Does it matter to you now that you're here and it's real?" Vera looked at the bridge for a long time. The river ran below, the unfinished span moving around the recovered girder that still needed to be fished from the mud and set in its proper place, carrying the light off its surface in the way rivers carry light, which is in pieces, scattered and inconstant. "My grandfather signed that deed in 1932, she said. "He was 62 years old, and the country was falling apart around him, and he gave away 60 acres of bottom land that his father had broken from raw ground because he believed the people in this county needed a crossing, and he had the means to make it possible." She paused. "He didn't do it to see the bridge. He did it because the bridge needed to exist. He understood the difference." She looked back at Garrett. Clifton understood it too. He drove that 12-mile detour every spring for 25 years without complaining, because complaining about the absence of a thing doesn't build the thing. You do what you can, and you trust that eventually someone will do the rest. She looked at the span. "I'm not here to see it finished for myself. I'm here because finishing it is the right thing, and someone needed to keep it from going sideways." She said the last part with a slight change in her expression that was the closest thing to humor she had displayed all morning, and Garrett caught it, and something in him shifted in the way that things shift when you have been wound very tight for a long time, and something finally allows you to ease. He shook her hand again. This time it was not formal. It was the handshake of two people who have arrived at a mutual understanding through the particular process of one of them being wrong and discovering it. The Liebherr LTM 1160 was inspected over the following 2 days by Consolidated's equipment team and by an independent assessor retained by the insurance company. The findings were better than anyone had expected, given the nature of the incident. One outrigger assembly was bent beyond serviceable tolerance and required replacement. 3 hydraulic lines had sustained damage during the fall or the recovery. The cab had cosmetic damage on the rotated side. The boom, which had spent 6 days partially submerged in river water, needed full inspection and lubrication of all pivot points. None of it was structural. None of it was the kind of damage that ends a machine's working life. The crane was transported to Consolidated's equipment yard in Indianapolis for repair. The lead technician who handled the work, a man named Gerald Foss, who had been servicing heavy equipment for 30 years, told Garrett over the phone that the Liebherr had come through the event in remarkable condition, given what it had experienced. "How remarkable?" Garrett asked. "Put it this way," Foss said. "Whatever method you used to ride it was gentler than you'd expect. Most recoveries of this type involve dynamic loading, sudden force applications, things that stress the frame in ways you don't always see immediately but show up in the metal over time. This machine looks like it was tipped back rather than jerked back. The rotation was gradual enough that the frame stress is well within acceptable limits." Garrett thought about the 4 minutes of steady patient pull, the engine that barked its rhythm without variance or urgency, the operator who had never changed her throttle position by more than a quarter inch in either direction. "That's about right," he said. The bridge opened on schedule. November 22nd, 1995, 2 days before Thanksgiving. Garrett was present for the opening, which was not a formal ceremony so much as the practical event of the first vehicle crossing the new span, which was a Shelby County road maintenance truck that the county engineer drove across at 7 in the morning with no particular ceremony, because county engineers are practical people, and practical people mark completions by using the completed thing rather than by standing next to it and making speeches. Garrett watched the truck cross from the east bank. He watched it reach the West Bank and continue down the county road toward wherever the county engineer needed to be that morning. And he felt the particular satisfaction of a completed bridge that is different from the satisfaction of any other kind of completed work, because a bridge is a permanent argument against the distance between 2 points, and every vehicle that crosses it is another small endorsement of the argument. He wrote 2 checks that afternoon. The first was made out to the Shelby County Historical Society for $15,000, $5,000 more than Vera had asked for. He included a note explaining that the additional amount was his own contribution rather than the company's, and that it was personal. The second check required a phone call first. He called the president of Consolidated Bridge Corporation, a man named Harold Birch, who had been running the company for 20 years and who had heard Garrett's full account of the recovery operation in a phone call the previous week. Birch had been quiet through most of that account, in the way that senior executives are quiet when they are calculating implications. At the end of it, he had asked 2 questions. First, is the crane serviceable? Second, did we make our deadline? The answers to both were yes. Birch had been quiet for another moment and then said, "Whatever you need to do to express the company's gratitude to the people involved, do it. Use your judgment." Garrett called him back the afternoon the bridge opened. The Historical Society, he said, they're building a machinery barn at the county fairgrounds. They need $10,000 to complete the construction. Done, Birch said. There was a pause. Harold Garrett said, yes. A 78-year-old woman with a 1928 tractor solved a problem in 4 minutes that our crane companies couldn't solve in 5 days. I want to make sure we understand what that means. Birch was quiet for a moment. Tell me what you think it means. It means we need to be more careful about what we dismiss, Garrett said. We brought in certified professionals with certified equipment, and they looked at the situation and told us what they couldn't do. She looked at the same situation and told us what she could do. The difference wasn't equipment. It wasn't certification. It was the way she framed the problem. He paused. I've been managing construction sites for 14 years, and I laughed at her, he said. In front of my crew, I laughed at a woman who had already worked out the correct answer while I was still describing the problem. I'd like to not do that again. Harold Birch was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, write up what happened, the whole thing, send it to me, and I'll have it distributed to every project manager in the company. Garrett wrote it up that evening in his trailer before the crew broke down the site. He wrote it plainly and without flattery, in either direction, which was how he wrote everything. He described the ground failure, the 5 days of failed consultation, the appearance of Vera Calloway with her notebook paper calculations, and the 4 minutes of the recovery operation. He described the fuel gauge reading empty at the end of it and the laughter that followed, because that detail belonged in the record as much as anything else, possibly more. He wrote at the end, the operator was the safety system. The man in the seat is the intelligence. This is as true of old machines as of new ones, and truer of the people running them than of the machines themselves. He sent it to Harold Birch and went home for Thanksgiving. The Shelby County Historical Society broke ground on the machinery barn in the spring of 1996. It was a practical structure, steel frame and metal cladding, with a concrete floor and proper lighting, and enough space to house 18 pieces of antique farm and construction equipment that the society had been storing in various barns and sheds across the county. The Caterpillar 60 was the first machine moved into the barn when it was completed that summer. Vera was present for the moving. She drove the machine from her farm to the fairgrounds herself, the same route it had traveled to the construction site the previous October, 4 miles an hour, on steel tracks, the engine making its rhythm in the summer air. The society had arranged a small gathering of members and local residents, and they stood along the fairgrounds road to watch it come, and some of the older ones had seen the machine before at the county fair displays and felt the particular feeling of continuity that old things in working condition produce. And some of the younger ones had never seen anything like it and stood with an expression that Vera recognized as the expression her own face had made the first time she was old enough to understand what the machine was and where it had come from. She drove it into the barn and shut it down. A member of the society had made a small brass plaque that was mounted on a post beside the machine. It read Caterpillar Model 60, manufactured 1928, Peoria, Illinois. Purchased by Edmund Calloway, Shelby County, Indiana, 1928. Donated to the Shelby County Historical Society by the Calloway family. in memory of Edmund Callaway, 1870 to 1955, and Clifton Callaway, 1919 to 1967. Vera read the plaque and stood beside the machine for a moment. Then she went home and got back to work because there was always work and because that was the answer she had always given to moments that were larger than words. She farmed until 2001. At 84 years old, she handed the operation to her son Burl, who had been farming alongside her for 30 years and who knew the land the way she knew it, which was completely in the way that people know things they have been learning their entire lives. The caterpillar was part of what passed to Burl, as it had been part of what passed from Edmund to Clifton's father, and from him to Clifton, and from Clifton in absentia to Vera. In the late summer of 2004, a young farmer named Andrew Selkirk was harvesting soybeans on a parcel south of the Flat Rock River when his combine drifted too close to the bank of a drainage creek and the bank gave way beneath the machine's weight. The combine, a modern unit worth $200,000, slid into the creek bed and came to rest at a 40-degree angle with its header submerged. The creek was not deep, but the bank angle was steep enough and the ground soft enough that conventional recovery equipment could not get close without risking the same failure that had trapped the combine. Selkirk was 29 years old. He had been farming for 6 years. He called his equipment dealer, who called a recovery service, who came out and looked at the situation and told him what they could not do before telling him what they could, which was to bring in ground stabilization equipment and prepare the approach over the course of several days before attempting the recovery. A neighbor who had lived in Shelby County her whole life told Selkirk to call the Callaway farm. Burl Callaway arrived with the Caterpillar 60 the following morning. Andrew Selkirk watched a 76-year-old man on a 1928 machine assess the situation plan, the pull hook the chain, and have his combine back on solid ground in less time than the recovery services inspector had spent on the phone explaining why it couldn't be done that day. Selkirk stood next to his recovered combine and looked at the Caterpillar idling beside him. "My combine," he said to Burl, "has GPS guidance and automatic row sensing and a yield monitor and a satellite uplink that sends data to my agronomist in real time." He looked at the Caterpillar. "Your tractor has a seat and a chain." Burl shut down the engine. "That's about the size of it," he said. Selkirk was quiet for a moment. "And yours just saved mine." Burl climbed down from the steel seat. He looked at the machine the way the Callaway family had always looked at it, with the particular regard that is given to things that have earned it. "She's been doing that her whole life," he said. Vera Callaway died on March 14, 2009. She was 92 years old. The cause was simply the completion of a long life lived in full, the kind of ending that a doctor writes down in clinical terms, and that the people who love the person understand as something different, as the stopping of an engine that had run without interruption for longer than almost anyone could account for. She died at the farm, in the house where she had lived since her marriage to Clifton in 1942, in the county where Edmund Callaway had broken ground from raw soil in 1895. Outside the kitchen window, the north field was beginning its spring emergence, the particular green of Indiana farmland, in early March. That means the ground has decided to come back after winter. The funeral was held at the Methodist church in town. The church was full, which in Shelby County in 2009 meant something specific about who a person had been, because the county was small enough that full meant everyone who should be there was there. Garrett Harmon drove from Indianapolis. He was 60 years old now, retired from active project management consulting, occasionally for Consolidated and for 2 other firms that had sought him out over the years on the strength of his record. He had not seen Vera Callaway since the October of 1995, though he had thought about her with some regularity in the 14 years between, in the way that you think about encounters that changed how you understood something important. He stood in the reception line after the service and shook Burl Callaway's hand and said what people say in those moments, which is true but partial. Then he said, "Your mother saved my career in the fall of 1995. She did it in 4 minutes with a machine older than my father, and she didn't ask for anything in return except a donation to the Historical Society." He paused. "I spent my whole professional life believing that newer was better, that more technology meant more capability, that the solution to a hard problem was always the most sophisticated tool available." He paused again. "She was the most sophisticated tool I ever encountered. She just didn't look like one." Burl nodded. "She never looked like what she was," he said. "That was mostly intentional." The Caterpillar 60 remained at the county fairgrounds between fair seasons and came home to the Callaway farm for the heavy work that still arose, because farmland always has heavy work, and because the machine was still the right tool for certain categories of problem that modern equipment did not handle well. Burl ran it until his own hands were not as reliable as they once had been, and then his son Thomas ran it, which made Thomas the fourth generation of Callaways to operate a machine that Edmund had driven off the dealer's lot in 1928 at a cost of $2,800 a sum that had represented an enormous faith in the future at a time when the future was not being particularly encouraging about itself. Thomas Callaway had learned to drive the Caterpillar at 14, the same age his grandfather had learned, the same age Vera had learned. He had learned on the same steel seat, with the same hand crank, with the same requirement of understanding the machine's specific compression rhythm before the engine would agree to start. He had learned from Burl, who had learned from Vera, who had learned from Clifton, who had learned from Edmund. The machine had been in the family for 97 years. It had cleared stumps and moved buildings and pulled combines out of creek beds and righted a $500,000 crane in the fall of 1995. It had been rebuilt once from the ground up and repaired 100 times in the particular ongoing way that maintained equipment requires maintenance, which is continuous and attentive and never fully finished. It had been driven to the county fair every summer for 60 years of antique machinery displays and had been the first item housed in the barn that Vera's recovery operation had funded. The engine started on the third pull. It had always started on the third pull, which Thomas knew the way he knew his own name, because it was one of the first things Burl had told him when he began learning the machine. On the first pull, you prime the cylinder. On the second pull, you load the compression. On the third pull, she fires. Don't rush it. She knows what she's doing. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not transfer through books or certifications or databases or the accumulated documentation of professional practice. It transfers through time and proximity and the repeated experience of asking a thing to do work and watching how it responds and adjusting and asking again. It transfers through 3 generations of hands on the same steel seat and the same throttle lever and the same chain hooks. It transfers through the practice of reading ground, through the soles of your boots and reading load through the tension in a chain and reading the moment when a machine's resistance tells you it is about to become cooperation. Vera Callaway had that knowledge at 78 years old because she had been accumulating it since she was old enough to ride on the seat beside Edmund and watch his hands. She had been accumulating it through 53 years of farm work and through the winter of 1979, when she had taken the machine apart to its component elements and put it back together with a retired machinist who knew things about engines that were no longer being taught because the engines that required that knowledge were no longer being made. The engineers laughed at her. The crane fell over. The old machine pulled it back up. That is what happened on the bank of the Flat Rock River in Shelby County, Indiana, on the 17th day of October 1995. That is the complete account. What happened after is that a county got its bridge by Thanksgiving, that a historical society got its barn, that a project manager who had been certain about the hierarchy of old and new became less certain and managed his remaining projects with a habit of listening that had not been as developed in him before. That a piece of farmland along the east bank of a river that Edmund Callaway had believed in enough to give away in 1932 finally served the purpose he had intended for it 63 years later. The Caterpillar 60 stands in the machinery barn at the Shelby County Fairgrounds every winter. Every summer it comes out. Every summer it runs. And every time someone looks at it and says that old thing can't do much anymore, the Callaway family smiles with the patience of people who have heard that sentence before, and they let the machine answer for itself. It always does.